Shalom to everyone. Good evening and welcome to all our participants from across the country. I'm Dina Wachtel, and on behalf of my co-host Ayala Davis and all our colleagues here at Canadian Friends of Hebrew University, it is our pleasure to welcome you to our book club discussing The Last High by Dr. Daniel Kalla. We invited Hebrew University alumna Cynthia Knight to introduce our author and lead the conversation. Cynthia says about her time at Hebrew University, and I'm quoting, "It was one of the best years of my life, and it impacted me and continues to influence my life in so many ways." Cynthia, who lives in Montreal and New York City, is a screenwriter, producer, and showrunner who's worked in the film and television industry for over 20 years. She recently won a Writers Guild Award for a TV series she's developing about stepmoms. Her award-winning, critically acclaimed comedy series, Mohawk Girls, has been picked up by CBC and will be airing all summer in its prestigious Tuesday night comedy lineup, along with Kim's Convenience and Schitt's Creek. And guess what? Today is Tuesday, so after this book club, we can all tune in on CBC to watch the Mohawk Girls. It's at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. But now, comedy aside, we're moving on to tonight's topic. Feel free, please, to write your questions in the Q&A box, and Cynthia will do her best to incorporate it into the conversation. Cynthia, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Dina. I'm thrilled to be here. It's an honor, and I can't wait to hear what Daniel Kalla has to say about his writing and his dual career in his new book. I'm going to start with a little bio. Born, raised, and still residing in Vancouver, Dr. Daniel Kalla spends his days working as an emergency room physician in a major teaching hospital. In his off time, he writes and manages a dual career. He is the author of 10 books, which have been translated into 11 languages to date, and his Shanghai trilogy has been optioned for feature films. Daniel received his BSc in mathematics and his MD from the University of British Columbia, where he is now a clinical associate professor and the department head of a major urban ER. He is the proud father of 2 girls and a poorly behaved but lovable mutt, Milo. Welcome, Daniel. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Cynthia.
I want to hear all about the novel, and I know everyone wants to hear. So do you want to take it from here, and then I'll ask you some questions after?
Sure, that'd be great. I'll just have a little presentation for everybody, and then I'm really looking forward to the Q&A and discussion with you and the others, Cynthia. So I think I'll just make sure my screen is sharing, and nope, wrong screen. Did that change screens?
Yes, but it's
Sorry, I was warning you guys. I've done this many times, and every time it doesn't quite work as planned. Let's try one more
part
time.
of the Zoom world. It's totally good.
All right. Now you see the right screen, right?
Yeah.
Great.
Perfect.
Great. Well, thanks everybody. Thank you for joining me here, wherever the hell here is for all of you in this new virtual community of ours. I'd like to thank the Friends of Hebrew University of Jerusalem, especially Dina, for making this whole event possible. And thank you, Cynthia. It's an honor to be introduced by a fellow writer, an award-winning writer. Looking forward to watching your show. But thanks for emceeing tonight. And thanks Ayala and David for being behind the scenes. And anyway, I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes or so now, and then leave lots of rooms for question and discussion. It seems like an appropriate time to review a quick history of pandemics and how they compare and contrast to what we're going through in today's world. And then to talk about another type of pandemic, which I think is hiding in plain sight, to be honest. I'm not sure if it's the case for this event, but often when I speak, especially at medical conferences, the organizers collect speaker evaluations, which they later compile and send me. And being a naturally sensitive and competitive guy, I take these evaluations to heart. And if you're commenting now, I'd like to keep in mind that words can hurt. For example, in 2019, when someone wrote, "Kalla has all the medical expertise of a Gwyneth Paltrow and the scientific credibility of a Jenny McCarthy." That one hurt. But in my last 15 years, I've been lucky enough to be able to combine my two careers, emergency medicine and creative writing. And in my novels, medicine is always my gimmick, and I always capitalize on my clinical experience in my writing. I've written about the dangers of superbugs and resistance, the pitfalls of DNA evidence and blood lies, and I wrote a historical trilogy set around an Austrian Jewish doctor and his family who escaped Nazi Germany to the only place that would have them at the time in the wake of Kristallnacht, and that was the amazing cosmopolitan city of Shanghai. I'm really particularly proud of this trilogy as it shares a slice of little known but very vital history. And it's a story of bravery, dignity, and survival, both amongst the Jewish and the Chinese community at the time. But it all started for me with my first novel, Pandemic, which was truly inspired by my day job. I bet you remember SARS now. That spring in 2003, I sat on the SARS task force in Vancouver for the very short-lived time while the SARS screening clinic was supposed to run. And you know, at one of our first meetings, someone put up this map showing all the hot spots where SARS was in the world. And I was struck by the scattered distribution in places like China and Paris and Singapore, Toronto, of course. And I turned to the person beside me and said, how do we know the spread is random, not deliberate? And thus the whole idea for my novel Pandemic hit me. Pandemic tells the story of a fictional bird flu that springs up in rural China, which terrorists decide to weaponize. They use infective operatives as suicide bombers to spread the infection tactically and to try to hold the world hostage to their geopolitical agenda. Not surprisingly, their scheme doesn't plan out as planned. So I guess it's fair, one reviewer once said of me that Kalla is like a chicken little with an MD. And you know, people often ask me if my two worlds, writing and medicine, ever collide. And nowadays I do see more patients in the emergency department who have read my books. Curiously though, the very first person to compliment me on my writing turned out to be crazy. She was one of our frequent flyers, meaning she had hundreds of visits to the ER. And as soon as she saw me, she said, Dr. Kalla, I loved your book Pandemic. And then she proceeded to tell me she had stopped taking all her medications, and she launched into a series of bizarre delusions and very wacky thoughts. And later, when I was referring her to the psychiatrist, I told him that while the poor lady was very psychotic today, she did have this one wonderfully lucid and insightful moment during our interview. You know, and then there are other times when my two worlds of medicine and writing seem to sync just perfectly. And weirdly enough, that's often when I'm writing about end of times. And since I am a kind of doom and gloom guy, let's talk about some of Pandemic's all-time greatest hits. Here's the top 10 list in terms of deadliness of pandemics. The Black Death killed up to 200 million people. The Spanish flu up to 100 million, and smallpox over 50 million. So COVID would have a hell of a way to go to catch up to those bad boys. Let's talk about what's indisputably Pandemic's all-time biggest hit, and that's the Black Death. The Black Death was a very specific form of the bubonic plague caused by this nasty bacteria, Yersinia pestis. You know, most people blame this little critter, the black rat, for spreading the plague. In fact, it's spread by these ugly bastards, the rat fleas. Rats are just the most common carriers of the fleas, but many other animals are susceptible carriers too. And the bubonic plague is still with us today. It's still endemic in the US Rockies, and there are sporadic outbreaks, especially in Africa and places like Madagascar. But the modern day plague is a pale shell of what used to be during the time of the Black Death. And this is how the Black Death, the bubonic plague, gets its name, the so-called buboes, the swollen, discolored lymph nodes in the armpits and the groin. The bubonic form of this plague is spread by flea bites. But in rarer cases, and I should have warned you about this slide, sorry, but bubonic plague can be spread to the lungs and become the pneumonic or chest plague, or even worse, it can get in the bloodstream and cause this kind of gangrene and septic plague. And the chest plague is the plague that humans can spread to other humans, just like COVID. And the Black Death was the mother of all plagues. It refers specifically to the second great plague pandemic of 1347 to 1351. So what made the Black Death so bad? Well, first of all, the spread. In an age before any real travel, except for a few traders and sailors, it spread from Sicily to Norway and Russia in under 3 years, suffocating Europe in a time before any real travel. The second distinct feature was the death toll, which was unparalleled. 50 million people died at least in 4 years, up to 200 million. Up to 60% of Europe perished. In fact, European population wouldn't reach pre-plague levels for another 500 years. Now, in the Middle Ages, there was no medical science, no hygiene, no public health, no antibiotics, but the Black Death was the very worst natural disaster in recorded time, without a doubt. And the thing about it was that during that time, the pneumonic and septic plague ran rampant. And unlike the modern day plague, person-to-person spread was very common. Whole villages were wiped out in days. In fact, there was a famous medieval poem that said, that went well to bed in the morrow dead. Doctors attending patients, priests giving last rites, and lawyers completing wills all died in the droves. Aside from the lawyers, it was quite a tragedy. But maybe what interests me most about the Black Death isn't all the death, but rather its incredible and lasting societal and cultural impact. What's more, the plague led to acts of unspeakable cruelty. Parents abandoned their own children for being infected. Towns boarded up infected houses with people trapped inside, leaving them to starve or perish from the plague. And interestingly, and particularly relevant to the Jewish community, it was one of the very first acts of truly organized genocide. Jews from across Europe at the time, especially in Germany and Switzerland and France, were killed by the thousands. They were usually burned at the stake after being blamed for inciting the plague, often by poisoning the wells would be the accusation. And just like the time of the Nazis, there was a pragmatic motive behind this mass murder. The Jews who were barred from most other medieval trades were often the moneylenders. And what better way to wipe out a debt than to eliminate the debtors? In simple terms, the Black Death, like most pandemics, led people to extremes of behavior. People became either more devout, believing they were suffering for their sins, or they became hedonistic and fatalistic in an ultimate live for today attitude. Just like with the Black Death we are seeing today, that very same phenomenon. The truth is, pandemics bring out the best and the worst in people. Like these people in the top corner who are volunteering to personally donate essential items to those in need. And then, of course, there are these idiots in the bottom corner who show up with their automatic guns and congregate in close quarters to protest their personal freedoms, as if a virus can read the Constitution. But the Black Death also weakened the stranglehold of the church and ended the medieval grip of superstition. Literature, art, science all flourished. And because of overcrowding, the plague selectively killed off more of the poor and lower classes, and it led to a decrease in the supply of laborers, which in turn led to the empowerment of the working class and ultimately the end of feudalism. There probably wouldn't have been a Renaissance without the Black Death, which goes to show that pandemics can just change society for the better. And I guess it's long digressions like these that led someone on a 2018 evaluation to write of me, Kalla's talk would have been better if someone else gave it, and didn't use his slides. Let's now turn to pandemic's second greatest all-time hit, and that would be the Spanish flu of 1918. What a piece of nastiness this was. The great influenza pandemic infected up to half the world's population in a matter of a year or two, and up to 100 million people died. And unlike COVID, most of the victims were mainly young adults between the age of 20 and 40. Soldiers carried the Spanish flu home from the front lines of World War II, and more people died of the Spanish flu than in either World War. As you can see from this graph below, in terms of mortality, it had 3 peaks, and it's certainly its dreaded second wave that we're hearing so much talk of now in COVID was the worst with the Spanish flu. In fact, by the end of 1919, the average life expectancy had dropped by 20 years because of the Spanish flu. Here's an army barracks converted to a makeshift hospital in 1918. Does that look familiar to people? So much of what we learned about quarantine, social distancing, etc., came from hard lessons acquired during the Spanish flu. And here's an example of social distancing. And it's even more apt 100 years later today after what happened in Tulsa this weekend. But this is the St. Louis versus Philadelphia story. And it shows how effective social distancing can be, and a lack of social distancing can be such a disaster. Both St. Louis and Philadelphia at the time had similar populations, and they were only 900 miles apart. But St. Louis canceled their wartime fundraising parade in the fall of 2018, and Philadelphia did not. More than 200,000 people showed up, and the result was catastrophic. Within 2 weeks, tens of thousands of people died in Philadelphia, while far few people died overall in St. Louis. And the truth is it worked in St. Louis in 1918, and it can work here a century later. We really have no choice but to practice social distancing. You know, it's hard to think that 100 years after the Spanish flu that we've really won any kind of war against infectious diseases. These are just some examples of all the re-emerging and newly emerging threats of infectious diseases across the planet. In the last 50 years, we've seen the emergence of Ebola, HIV and AIDS, H1N1. And of course, pandemic is busy topping all the charts again with its lead hit today, COVID-19, the new kid on the block. As of today, there are almost 10 million cases in the world with close to 500,000 deaths and no sign of stoppage anytime soon. And we can't talk about COVID without looking at a bunch of annoying graphs, right? But they're important. While the curve is flattening in many places, we have nowhere near won the war on this pandemic. And flattening the curve isn't intended just to decrease the absolute number of cases, although it almost always does that too. It is meant to slow the rate of people getting sick, to prevent the healthcare system and therefore the economy from collapsing, like we saw in late March in poor Italy, for example. And right now, without a vaccine or a very good treatment option, flattening the curve through social distancing is our only real option to combat this disease. And you can't stop just once the curve begins to flatten, as the US is discovering right now. I like this analogy. The curve is flattening is like saying we can start, the curve is flattening, we can start lifting the restriction now, is like saying the parachute has slowed our rate of descent. We can take it off now. Just not so. So how will COVID end? Well, here are a few theories. It'll burn out through mass infection and herd immunity. I hope this isn't the case, because that means there'll be tens of millions of deaths in the wake of it. There will be an effective treatment cocktail, which is probably what will happen. There will be no one magic bullet drug, but a combination of drugs. There was big news about a drug called dexamethasone last week that's showing some real promise. And through vaccination, we're all got our fingers crossed. There are over 100 vaccines in development, but no one has ever conquered an RNA virus before. So we're guardedly optimistic a vaccine will be available soon and effective. Social distancing will definitely quell it. They've proved that across the world. Will there be a second peak in the fall? I think there will be some kind of peak when the weather changes, but I think we're going to see a whole series of little peaks over the next 18 months. And we're going to have to loosen and then go back to social distancing as we see more cases come. I think that is our fate until we have an effective vaccine. I mean, obviously it's natural for something as awful as a pandemic like COVID to instill fear and anxiety, but there are times when I genuinely fear for the future of humanity. This is a real picture of a guy in Asia smoking through his mask. I mean, I think as a species, dolphins must have passed us on the intelligence scale by now, and potted plants must be nipping at our heels. But there is reason for hope. The Renaissance followed the Black Death, and the Roaring '20s followed the Spanish flu. COVID won't be another Spanish flu. We've come too far. Effective treatments will emerge, will flatten the curve. And major catalysts, as I said, have had to be a change for better and more enlightened times. But I'd like to spend the last few minutes of my didactic time discussing a truly under the radar but devastating pandemic that is gripping most of the world right now, at least the first world. What I still believe is and will be the worst epidemic of the 21st century, and one that I would argue is the closest thing we have to the Black Death or the Spanish flu in modern times, since its victims are so relatively young. Of course, I'm speaking of the opioid epidemic. It's almost pointless to compare opioid crisis to the COVID pandemic, but I'm going to anyway, if only to make a few points. The US is the country worst hit in the world by COVID. Its death toll is staggering and tragic, with 123,000 dead, and the average age of death is 80. But now compare that to the death from opioids over the last 20 years. More than 500,000 Americans, mainly young Americans, have died since 2000. Average age of death mid-30s. And look at the spike on the curve on those graphs. In 2017 and 2018, almost 50,000 people were dying a year from opioid overdose. You might argue that opioid overdose is a lifestyle choice, that it can't be compared to an infectious pandemic. First of all, I don't accept that, but even if I do, this stat of 500,000 includes many, many, many people who were not opioid addicts. Some were trying it for the first time, some were accidentally overdosing on it, and many didn't even know they were trying it. Moreover, I really believe it's time we acknowledge and treat addiction as a genetically inheritable illness, not a criminal offense or a stigma. And let's look at the stats from Canada, because we're not doing any better when it comes to opioids. With COVID, we are doing better, and we've only had about 8,500 deaths. But in the last 3 years alone, there's been almost 13,000 young Canadians who died. Some of those tried fentanyl for the first time or didn't know they were taking it. And many of them, even the hardest core addicts, might have kicked their habits and led a full productive life. Such a waste of life. The good news is that in the last couple of years, we have been making a difference through harm reduction strategy. The curve has been flattening. Some of those strategies include take-home naloxone kits, safe injection sites, enhanced addiction services and rehab, and finally, opioid agonist therapy. This is when you replace a dangerous street drug with a more predictable opioid, like methadone, or in our new case, in the case of a new drug that's very promising, Suboxone. We've got the deaths down to about 40,000 to 45,000 deaths a year, which is still 130 deaths a day in the US, and that could go on forever. What's worse is that the opioid crisis is entirely man-made. I mean, I guess if you watch a lot of Fox News, you might believe COVID is too, but this is our creation. And in fact, doctors play a huge role in the creation of the opioid crisis. 9 out of 10 American opioid users were launched down their disastrous path through the use of prescription medication, most of which were legitimately prescribed to them. So what makes opioids so addictive? Opioids bind to the receptors in the brain and spinal cords, disrupting the signals. They also activate the reward area of the brains by releasing the hormone dopamine, creating a feeling of euphoria or high. And as strong as most users crave that high, it's more often the fear of the horrible withdrawal, the so-called dope sickness, that keeps users desperate to find that next fix. And why is opioids so deadly? All opioids suppress the drive to breathe if taken in a big enough quantity. For the victims, it's the equivalent of suffocating or drowning in room air. But the potency varies so much between opioids. It might take 200 tablets of codeine to overdose versus 1 hit of fentanyl or less. And as I'll get to later, because the street product has no quality whatsoever, every time he or she uses, a user uses, he or she is effectively playing a form of Russian roulette. The reason overdose deaths have climbed 700% over the past 10 years is simple chemistry. Fentanyl is 100 times more potent than heroin. Superfentanyls, analogs like carfentanil, are 100 times that of fentanyl, or 10,000 times as potent as heroin. And while 1 kilo of heroin and 1 kilo of fentanyl cost roughly the same to make, about $7,000, a kilo of fentanyl gives multiples times as many hits and has a street value of close to $2 million versus only 80,000 for the same amount of heroin. It's this huge profit disparity that makes it so appealing to traffickers and dealers, despite the massive human cost. This is a drug bust. It's out of my last month in my hometown, or in a suburb of my hometown, Burnaby, BC, that netted the equivalent of 20 million doses of fentanyl, 20 kilos seized. And those doses become even deadlier if they're cut with carfentanil. Most of the supply of raw fentanyl is shipped or smuggled into North America from China or Mexico. But in illicit fentanyl labs hidden all across the cities, it gets cut into fentanyl by cooks with all kinds of products. They create those little tabs they call fake oxys, and they add things like baking soda, food coloring, super fentanyls, God knows what else. And often they add these super potent fentanyls to give the product a real punch, and also to save on the amount of fentanyl they have to expend and get more bang for their buck. But there's zero quality control, and the wrong batch can prove incredibly lethal, which is kind of the premise of my new book. The greed, stupidity, and malice involved in the criminal fentanyl trade, organized and otherwise, is staggering, especially in Vancouver, which I go into depth to describe in the last high. The laundering of fentanyl profits is so well established in Vancouver that's known around the world as the Vancouver model. And when many of us think of victims of fentanyl and opioids, we typically think of images like these: hardcore IV drug users living in a world completely detached from the rest of ours. Or maybe movie and rock stars who've lost their ways, like all of these three major icons who died of opioid overdose. But the truth is, opioids do not exclusively kill hardcore users. The people often at the highest risk of dying are the first-time dabblers or relapsed addicts whose systems have no tolerance for the extreme potency of the drug. There are so many examples of people who die from opioids unaware they've ever consumed them, and the victims come in all shapes and sizes, every age, gender, and socioeconomic standing. And the collateral damage is enormous. Look at the poor kid in the back of that car. He's sitting there. It's a real picture from Ohio as his two parents have overdosed in the front seat. I've tried to capture all of this in my new book, and The Last High is a gritty, realistic look at the opioid crisis in Vancouver, but it could be any city. It tells the story of an ER physician, a former addict herself, and a homicide detective who worked together to track down the source of an ultra-potent fentanyl that killed a group of unsuspecting teens and threatens to kill many, many more. While The Last High is fictional and meant to entertain, the book explores the perfect storm of greed, crime, addiction, and misguided policy that fuels the deadliest epidemics we have ever faced. And I believe it could easily happen tomorrow, pretty much exactly as I've written it. It's also one of the most personal novels I've written. Working at St. Paul's for the past 20 years, I've lived through the opioid tragedy, sometimes on a daily basis. And this may be one of the most important messages I've ever tried to tell. The opioid crisis can touch anyone. I want to read a short passage now, if that's okay, that I hope helps illuminate how pervasive the opioid issue is and how it can affect anybody. Prologue. The house music courses through Alexa. The hypnotic beat and melting layers of sound feel as if they come from within, as if her heart is the amplifier, and the warmth is so enveloping, like being lowered into the most perfect bubble bath. The bliss is almost unbearable. Alexa can't lift her head off her chest, but she can move her eyes. With a quick sweep of the room, she sees all the friends who matter most to her: Rachel, Nick, Joshua, Grayson, and Taylor. The only ones who matter at all, really. Taylor, her very best friend, is slouched at a weird angle on the couch beside her. Taylor had promised to ensure Alexa got some alone time with Josh at the party, even though she has a crush on him too. Typical Taylor, always putting her friends first. Taylor's eyes are still open, but the pupils are tiny as pinholes. And her complexion, it's grayish blue, while her lips have turned almost purple. So strange, but it's so beautiful. Alexa shifts her gaze to the left and sees Josh and Gray sprawled out on the other couch, propped up only by their abutting shoulders. Josh's eyes are as glassy as Taylor's, while Gray's eyes are shut altogether. They're both so still. And Josh's exposed arms are mottled deep, dark blue. Alexa wishes she could tell him just how much she loves him. Tonight was supposed to be the night. Alexa looks down at her own hands. Her fingers feel foreign to her, and the color of her nails match those of Taylor's lips. She knows it's not right, but it's so wild. The floating warmth intensifies. Alexis feels as though she's falling off the couch, even though she's not moving. She's never drunk anything more than a beer or two in her 16 years. How could one cup of Nick's punch make her so woozy? Somewhere in the back of her brain, she can hear her mother's panicked voice, a distant scream telling her to breathe. But her mom's nowhere near the party. Alexa finds it all kind of funny. She wants to laugh. She wants to tell Taylor how exquisitely wrong it all is, but she can't even move her lips. Besides, dreams are stealing over her now, and she can't hold on any longer. Thank you. Well, in BC, we can and have made a bit of a difference to the opioid crisis. According to one study, 5,000 lives were saved by the harm reduction methods that we instituted, even though 2,000 people died. But just when we had started to flatten the curve on the opioid crisis, we're seeing another spike in deaths because of COVID. In BC in May, we had the highest death toll ever of 170 people that died from opioid overdoses. There were a number of reasons for it, but they included less social services available, more isolation, a sense of anxiety that always fuels drug use, and especially this odd paradoxical belief of users that it's safer for them to use alone than to use with others for exposing some of themselves to COVID-19, which is ridiculous, obviously. We really need to apply the same kind of aggressive approach to opioids as we have done to COVID over these last few months. So what do we learn this evening? Aside from that in life, you generally get the quality you pay for, we've learned pandemics are inevitable. We have survived worse. Good things can and do come from pandemics. We can apply our response to other crises, homelessness, poverty, mental health, and especially the opioid crisis. And finally, the opioid epidemic will be with us long after COVID-19. And until we do something substantial and definite to help those suffering and to prevent new users from falling into that world, it's going to be a vicious, horrible cycle. So not to blow my own horn, but to end on a high note, I thought I'd share a positive review I received in 2017, where it said it was a bit dull and not very informative, but overall you did fine, dear. That was from my mom. So finally, just to end, I don't think I've ever been more proud of a story than Last High. And I think it's a good thriller and a solid whodunit, but entertainment aside, I really meant it to be a cautionary tale. If you have teenage kids or older kids or kids in their 20s or anyone, I hope they'll read it too. Honestly, no one's immune from this scourge. So with that, I think I'll stop sharing my screen and turn it back to Cynthia to facilitate the discussion.
Thank you so much. Wow, I thought we were going to hear about the book, which I loved, and but I've learned so much about pandemics and plagues, and of course, I'm sure the attendees and I have loads of questions about that. But since we're talking about your book, I wanted to read a little review. When Dina asked me to be here, I checked to see if there was an audiobook version of your novel, The Last High, so I can just check it out and know what I was getting into. And I emerged about a day later like, oh my God, that was so good. It was fantastic. It was riveting. And it really, really, really imparted a sense of what you're talking about, how it just hits every socioeconomic strata of society. And it's not those images we perhaps picture. And I think it really enables us to become much more compassionate and aware.
Thank you.
Here we go. Robin Harding, from the author of the international best-selling The Arrangement and the Party, says, The Last High is a riveting thriller. The Last High features the most evil and insidious of villains, opioids. This important must-read book is not only well-researched and entirely realistic, it gives a human face to a devastating epidemic. And one more from the Chronicle Herald says, Michael Crichton ought to be looking over his shoulder. That was a good one. So you talked a little bit about what made you write about the opioid crisis epidemic and your work, but how did you decide what angle to come in on? I mean, you made it into a detective story as well as a medical one.
Yeah, I mean, that's I always try to write stories and write in a style or voice that I would want to read myself. And I found when I was growing up to learn about something, history is a great example. I would pick up a James Michener book because I always find that if you could build history or science like Michael Crichton, he's such a great example. And by the way, I'll reference that quote in a second because there's a bit of a story behind it. But I always find if you could pass important messages or not, or knowledge in my case, because I'm a doctor and, and I have a bit of a behind the curtain view. If I can build a story and characters that people invest in, and, for me, suspense and thrillers are always the best way to keep somebody's attention, then people will passively learn something, hopefully, without feeling like they've been lectured to or that, it's a dry text. I thought it was really important. This is a difficult subject matter. It starts with teenagers dying. So many young people die. I didn't want it to be all tragic. I wanted some funny characters. I wanted some lighthearted moments. I wanted to make it real. And I think by making it real and putting it in the context of an everyday world, I hope it makes it even more relevant to people, you know. By the way, though, Cynthia, just before, I do have to mention that, because publishers recycle quotes all the time, and that's an old quote, obviously. Michael Crichton, one of my all-time favorite writers, has been dead for 11 or 12 years, sadly. He died too young. But he also died rather unexpectedly right before one of my books was being published. And the day before they published that quote on the cover of the book, he had just passed away. So it seems so incredibly tacky to say Michael Crichton was looking over.
Oh, no.
But they still use that quote. So, yeah.
He's probably laughing.
Yeah.
So speaking of realistic, what made you decide to have a doctor in your book team up with a detective? Is that something you can imagine happening? Is that a liberty you took in order to bring these two worlds together?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's a bit of a, you know, a literary device, I guess, but for a very specific intent. You know, really the two worlds that opioid straddles is the medical world, the health world with all the damage, and then the criminal world, you know, the supply. I knew everything. I'd seen 20 years I've been dealing with opioid overdose. I know this, and I know the users, I know the, you know, the impact. I've seen the tragedy. What I didn't know is much about the criminal supply side, where it comes from, who controls it, how it, and so by having both a doctor and a detective as the lead protagonists, I could show both. And I had a friend, I was so fortunate. I had a friend who's a wonderful guy, a bit of a crazy guy who's been an undercover RCMP cop for 20 years and who knows this drug world inside and out. And he gave me a crash course on the criminal side. So I think I like to think I brought a very authentic point of view to the criminal side. But yeah, you know, to make it a thriller, to make it a suspenseful story, I wanted to have a foot in both camps, as it were. You're cutting out, Cynthia.
Hello?
Hi.
I'm trying to join the meeting with Cynthia Knight.
Hello?
Oh, what happened here? We lost you, Cynthia?
Cynthia, your audio is out.
I just joined the meeting, but I'm not Cynthia.
Oh, okay. We're just doing questions and answers. Well, Cynthia's working on that. There are some written questions that I can go ahead and ask and
please go ahead, Dan.
So somebody asked me, how much blame for opioid epidemic would you attribute to the pharmaceutical companies? I would attribute a lot of blame to the pharmaceutical companies. Purdue in particular in the US was, in my opinion, absolutely criminal in the way they pushed a drug called OxyContin. So many people, more so in the US than Canada, although lots in Canada too, became addicted to opioids because of that horrible drug OxyContin. When the pharmaceutical companies, and doctors were complicit too, but especially pharmaceutical companies tried to push the concept that nobody should ever feel pain. And so many millions and millions of unnecessary prescriptions for OxyContin were written. So it's been an absolute tragic crisis. And I think from a criminal point of view, that we're going to see outcomes. I think we'll see trials. I think someday that some people behind that will be brought to some form of justice. I hope so anyway, because I think they knew what they were doing.
Dan, maybe I'll jump in. It's Dina with some question that I've read your book and I absolutely loved it. I'm jumping in until Cynthia will rejoin us. But there is a quote that you wrote in the book that says, "We're doing our job best when no one notices us." What do you mean by that? I loved it.
Well, that was specifically about when the heroine, Julie is talking about, is trying to describe what it means to be an emergency doctor. And you people all love your doctors and, your consultants and your family doctors. Emergency doctors are the most anonymous doctors in medicine. We tend to have one interaction with many people. And, it's a slightly facetious way of saying, when we get noticed, it's often not for the good reason. People aren't happy with us. I have a friend who always compares us to a hockey referee. When you don't get noticed, you're doing a good job out there. So that's not true. We often get a lot of gratitude, but we don't form the long-term rapport that other doctors do. So sometimes it's best to keep a low profile.
Whoops. You mentioned in the presentation that you did BC as being, and especially Vancouver, you mentioned the Vancouver model. Is it really bad in British Columbia more than in the other provinces in Canada?
Yeah, much worse. So Vancouver has a much bigger opioid addiction issue than any other relative to its size. Partly, one of the huge reasons is because homelessness as a lifestyle can exist year round in Vancouver, whereas in Montreal, as you know, it's the temperature doesn't permit people. We have thousands of people living on the street in Vancouver, and we're also a port city. We've tended to attract a lot of a lot of drug problems. So Vancouver, yeah, the opioid deaths are much higher relative per capita than any other city. Vancouver is the epicenter of Canadian opioid addiction.
I see that Cynthia is back. I'll just throw another connected questions to that. So I assume that COVID-19 will really increase the problem because of social distancing. Is that correct?
Yeah. And as I was trying to point out in the presentation, it's ironic. Some of the users were thought that they couldn't go to safe injection sites or be close to other users, when in fact, we've had hardly any of our downtown east side. I don't think we've had a single death from COVID, and we had 170 deaths from opioid addiction. The risk of using, and the problem with opioids, if you use with somebody else who can get you help, the naloxone, the antidote shot, or if you're using in a safe injection site, you're so much less likely to die. If you're using alone, it's thousands of % higher risk of death.
Thank you. Back to you, Cynthia.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
See, good old-fashioned headphones with the cord. So did you go through the questions so far that were in the Q&A, Dina?
Yeah,
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. So as a fellow writer, Daniel, I'd love to know how on earth you got into writing, being a doctor. Like one seems hard enough. One's hard enough for me. How did you get into writing, and how do you manage doing both? Yeah,
I mean, I often get asked that, and I always felt without any real evidence or proof that I could write. I love telling stories. I mean, as you know, that's sort of the fundamental of, I don't consider myself a great, certainly not a literary author. I'm not even, I'm not even that complimentary necessarily in my prose, but I do think I can tell a good story. And I always knew that, and I always wanted to do that. I felt this compulsion. I mean, medicine was in my family. Like, I'm a third generation doctor. You go to a family reunion, you can't swing a dead cat without hitting 3 doctors. But for me, I had this, drive and desire that one day I would. And, after I had finished training, and about 20 years ago, I had my first daughter, and I just said, I cajoled two of my best friends into taking a writing course, screenwriting course, actually. And the teacher, who was such a mentor to ours and so supporting, it just was enough to launch me. I just, once that's my addiction, once I got that bug, I knew that I would do this and had to do it. The balance, emergency medicine's a great job for balancing other careers. We work shift work. I don't work full time anymore. There's lots of opportunities. You scratch an emergency room, you find all kinds of things, an aspiring realtor, a rock star, everybody has a side deal, it seems, to a degree. And certainly this was mine.
Wow, that's good for your next story.
Mm-hmm.
Here we go. Alexi Schwartzman would like to know, what's your writing protocol? Do you write on a regular basis or during holidays? How do you manage it with your busy schedule?
Yeah, I love it. I mean, if I have a week to write and nothing to do, I won't write anything. Like, I'm one of those people that you give me one thing to do and I'll never get it done. You give me 7 things to do and I'll get 5 of them done. I thrive, and it's part of what makes me, why emergency medicine is good for my personality. I thrive off deadlines and pressures and multitasking. It's when I write best. So I don't have any protocol whatsoever. I don't have any, I don't write at the same computer. I don't write at the same time of day. All I need is an idea and some inspiration, and I'm good to go.
So you can't answer how long it takes you to write a novel then, it sounds like, because it's different for everyone, right?
Yeah, but in terms of a first draft of a novel, like this novel, just like, I basically puked it out. Now, anybody who hasn't bought it won't buy it now. But like it emerged so quickly in a matter of 3 or 4 months, just because it felt so right. I knew the information, I knew the city, because Vancouver's a big character in this story. So it was so easy to write. But the Shanghai trilogy, which was my historic trilogy about World War II China, took a lot of research, and that was, it took me a year and a half to write each of the first drafts of those novels. It was a very different writing process. Um, so yeah, so this was probably one of the shortest, 3 to 4 months to a year and a half would be the kind of span for a first draft for me.
Uh-huh. And speaking of Vancouver, you did such a beautiful job at really painting a picture. I've only been there once in the past 20 years, and I really felt like I was feeling the city and getting to see and experience the city.
Yep.
And there's such a diversity of ethnicities and different kinds of people and types of people and religions and cultures. Is that true to Vancouver, or were you trying to make sure you had sort of diversity in there?
Well, both, but as a reflection of Vancouver, I mean, it truly is one of the most, certainly in Canada, one of the most cosmopolitan cities. We have a huge Asian population. We have a huge, it's a very diverse population. We don't have a huge Jewish population as it happens, but it's a very diverse population in Vancouver. And the drug trade is reflective of that. I was very accurate in that the Chinese gangs play a big role. Persian, Iranian gangs, South Asian gangs play a huge role in the drug trade. There's lots of homegrown gangs, as well, but the ethnicity. I think I was very accurate in the way I perceived, the way I portrayed both the criminal world and the medical world, And as you know, having read it, one of the heroes is a Chinese cop, or a Chinese Canadian cop. He's like third generation, but very proud of his heritage. And up until about a year ago, it was a Chinese Canadian was the chief of Vancouver Police Department, and we have the Vancouver Police Department is very multi-ethnic. My hospital is very multi-ethnic. It is a reflection of Vancouver.
David Stambler would like to know if you can tell us a little bit about some of the writing projects that you have in the pipeline.
All right, David, for you. I finished another novel, as it were. And I'm tackling in a very similar style, like a thriller style. I'm tackling the issue of vaccines, which might just be topical. It's all about the vaccine and anti-vax world. I've always been fascinated. I am not an anti-vaxxer. I'm very pro-vaccine, but I strive to understand the anti-vax point of view and world and give people a perspective on vaccines. And I didn't realize that, I didn't realize that vaccines were going to be quite as topical as they're coming in 2020. But I knew it was a hot button issue in medicine. And so, yeah, my next novel is it's set in Seattle, but it's a big thriller all around the vaccine world. So. And now we're just discussing projects after that. And so I like to be a book ahead. It feels good.
Any nonfiction writing and any screenwriting?
No, I'm going to leave the screenwriting to you. We've got to divide that up, Cynthia. No, well, it's too limited for me. I don't know how you can tell a story in like 10,000 words and 20,000 words. Like it doesn't seem you have enough words. I need a full novel style manuscript to tell my stories. So no, but I've been doing a lot of nonfiction, since COVID hit. I've written op-eds in the Globe and Mail and last weekend in the Toronto Star. More and more I'm writing nonfiction pieces, which I enjoy, but I can't imagine a long work of nonfiction. It just seems you have to be too accurate and do too much actual research for that. So I don't think that's where I'm going.
Well, what you do in a way is the best of both worlds. You teach us about the real world, but entertain us while you're doing it. So we don't know, we're learning.
And to that point, it really is important to me in my fiction that when I say something about the world of medicine, or in this case, the world of the opioids or the criminal world, that I'm accurate. Obviously it's a novel. And as you said, there are some artistic liberties taken. But when I talk about death rates, when I describe how someone dies or how the drugs are cut or how, it was really important for me to be very, very accurate.
I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about COVID-19. And if I'm treading on anything you've already answered because of my audio issue, just let me know.
Sure.
Barbara Halprin asks, to what do you attribute the lack of increase in COVID cases following the May long weekend and after the protest marches?
Where though? In the US?
Well, I'm guessing the May means, yeah, Memorial Day, and the protest marches. I mean, as Dina said, I'm in New York, so we're kind of waiting to see what happens with those
Well, exactly.
numbers.
It was just, the thing about COVID is there's this delayed effect, right? It's, it takes 2 weeks after the event to see the first cases, really a week or two to see. Then it takes another week or two to see the hospitalizations, and then it takes about 2 weeks to see the deaths. And, in the US alone, I think 25 states have spiked. They had the highest overall total, I think, anywhere in the US yesterday in terms of cases. And in Florida, there was over 4,000. I think it's coming. This isn't the second wave, by the way, because we never ended the first wave. But I think we're going to see a wave of deaths again. I mean, New York, I know where you are, has done a phenomenal job of, containing it and getting over it. But I think there's so many places where, I think it's akin to a forest fire, right? You put out one section and it flares up in another section. And I think we will see the impact. I fully support and agree with all the intention behind the Black Lives Matter and all the protests. But when that many people collect together, viruses don't care about race relationship. Viruses don't care about anything. So I think we are going to see another surge because of what's been going on. Certainly after Tulsa and another rally, we will.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, Canada and the US presumably are going to have to open the border soon, and well, that's worrisome.
Yeah, I don't know. They keep delaying it. I don't know. And I heard today that the European Union is thinking of doing a ban on all US travelers. I mean, it's not prejudice or not, it's just the fact that it's raging out of control. It was like the same way that that people were banning travel from China in January. It's just, it's almost common sense, to be honest.
Absolutely. And on that note, Marcia Pasco asks, do you feel the government, federal and provincial / state, do you think they're opening things up too quickly, e.g. restaurants, parks, etc.?
That's a great question. I think it really depends. I think in BC, where I am, they're doing it sensibly. I think in Ontario and Quebec, I think in most places in Canada, that the stepwise approach has been appropriate. I think it was totally inappropriate. Like Florida is a great example. They opened up so much when they still had lots of cases, and now they're one of the global hotspots. It's just like, it's this idea like you can just overcome this just by will, or pretending it doesn't exist, or pretending you have to get on with lives. It just doesn't work that way. And when the bodies are piling up and the hospitals are closing, no economy is going to thrive. Nobody's going to be going to restaurants, and it's not just a disease of old people. And it's not, it's just such a short-sighted, whatever your politics are, it's so short-sighted to think that you can just ignore it and go on with your life. I think I find it offensive, to be honest.
So do you think that, I mean, now let's say just take Canada, they're opening up. Do you think that it's just a balancing act of how much we open and then kind of close down a bit and for a couple of years, right?
Yeah, well, hopefully sooner if that vaccine works out, but I think it's got to be responsive like that. I think it's going to be region by region, city by city. When you don't, like, in Vancouver, we have a handful of cases, or our whole province, we have a handful of cases a day. I could go almost anywhere without a mask and touch anything and I'd be safe. If I did that in Arizona right now, almost for sure I would get COVID. Like, it all depends, where you are, and the prevalence dictates how careful you need to be.
Yeah.
I mean, there's still basic measures everybody needs to do, hand washing and, and masks when you're in certain places. But I think you can open up much more when you get the disease down to much less prevalent.
Right. Was it strange for you, having written a pandemic among some of your other novels, that like you kind of predicted the future, or was it inevitable for you that this was going to come?
No, I think that's a good point. I honestly don't think you have to be Nostradamus. I mean, it would be like me writing a book about a big earthquake somewhere in the world, and then we wake up in 15 years later saying, see, I predicted it. Of course, pandemics are going to come. We've been lucky they have been so mild over the last 100 years. It's given us a false sense of security, but it was entirely predictable. And so, no, it didn't take any great foresight on my part.
Has there ever been I don't know if you covered this before, has there ever been a vaccine for a coronavirus?
No, no,
Never.
I haven't covered it. No. In fact, coronaviruses are a type of RNA virus. There's DNA viruses, which are double-stranded, and RNA viruses. There's never actually been a vaccine for an RNA virus before. They've been notoriously difficult. So there are some big hurdles, in terms of getting an effective vaccine. But there's some promising early results out there. So, I'm hopeful, but it's never been done.
All right, I want to ask you a few last questions about writing and non-pandemic. Is there anything else you want to say to us about pandemics and COVID? And
surely I've depressed all of you enough about pandemics and stuff. Let's talk about something more hopeful.
Okay, well, and you've given us a lot of hope too about what's happened, some of the positives that come. So we'll cling to that. Lori Halperin says, thanks, Dan. And Robert Sarner says, have any of your novels been turned into films or TV dramas? I know your Shanghai trilogy was optioned, right, for a feature film. That people always think it's going to be a feature film the next second. It can be optioned for years or on and off. Or
yeah,
so,
you know this process, Cynthia, but probably not everybody out there does.
Right.
I've had 4 or 5 of my works optioned and felt like it was closer and further. You're in the business, and I'm just a peripheral on the periphery of it, but I don't get my hopes up anymore. I mean, I'd love it if it happened, but it's such a big hurdle to go from optioning to actually getting your book made into something. So
right, especially now when we can't shoot anything. But
yeah,
yes, I have no doubt that they will eventually. Tamar Kraus would like to know who are writers you admire.
Tamar, every time somebody asks me that, I suddenly forget the name of every writer I've ever read in my entire life. But, different writers inspire me in different ways. Michael Crichton was a great example. I just loved how he could take a huge scientific concept and boil it into a digestible story. And another writer who is like that for me is Ken Follett. He always, he has such versatility. He can write a modern day thriller, or he can write an epic, historical novel like Pillars of the Earth and such. One of my favorite books. So writers like that. Robert Harris is another British writer who I admire and love. I read really eclectically, I don't read many medical thrillers. And I'm not a super fast reader. The last book I read was Eric Larson's the Something in the Vial, the story of Winston Churchill in 1940. It's nonfiction, but he writes like a novel. I've read all of his books, and I love the way he writes. And there's another writer, Bill Bryson, who writes a lot of travel books, and he's another one of my favorite nonfiction writers. So, I'm inspired by different kinds of writing, and it really depends on my mood and in the stage of my life, what I'm reading.
Yeah.
I wish I could. I see, I have so many people who reach to me and say, I read your book yesterday or what, and it just kills me because, it takes me minimum 2 weeks, usually a month to read any book. I don't know how anybody reads a book in a day or half a day, and I'm so envious of them. I'd love to be able to consume books like other people can.
This is why I must admit I often listen to audiobooks, because I can consume books while I'm walking, while I'm driving, while I'm exercising, while I'm cleaning, and I'm a really slow reader too, so it's been enabled me to read more. I'm
not the only writer who's challenged as a reader.
Yeah, it's terrible. I've tried to speed read, doesn't work. Sheila Romalis, I'm going to 2 more questions and then we'll let you go. Do you think that this recent book will be the most read of all your books?
That's a great question, Sheila. I don't know. Maybe in Canada. I mean, it's been on the Globe and Mail bestseller list for 6 weeks in a row, or, it was #2 in the Canadian fiction for a while. It's done very well in Canada. In the US, it hasn't done so well. It didn't get published that strong. So, my first book, Pandemic, still is my all-time. I think it's has sold over 300,000 copies now in various languages and stuff.
Wow.
It was just so timely. It's not my favorite book, by the way. I mean, people often quote it, but it's not the book I'm most proud of. Yeah. But I did love this story. I really hope, I got my kids. I've got one kid to read it. I'm trying to get my friends' kids to read it. Because I don't think people realize how vulnerable, you know, anyone is to the opioids, but especially, that university age and young, where, there are, in high school and stuff, where there are experimentations and you don't know the supply often of the drugs you're getting and stuff. And I really wanted it to give, to me, I don't know if you remember that series, Cynthia, Scared Straight, where they'd bring the young juvenile offenders, like it was 25 years ago, and they would bring those young juvenile offenders into the hardened, like Rikers, the worst prison, and some lifer who'd murdered like 5 people would just yell at them and tell them all the terrible things that they were going to abuse them and do to them when they came in as adult criminals, and the idea was just to scare them into, realizing that they had to go straight and stay away from crime. And this is my novelistic equivalent of Scared Straight when it comes to opioids. I really tried to get that message across that
Yeah.
no good can come of using these drugs.
Yeah, well, it was so great. I made it really clear that and these young people, I mean, who isn't young and open to trying something, and you don't know what you get, but your friend says it's fine and they got it from someone they trust, and next thing you know, as you depict, you're in the hospital. I'm going to paraphrase a bit from David Strambler. Do you have any solutions for stopping people from taking fentanyl, and 2, stopping fentanyl from getting into Canada? I know that you talk about how it comes in now, not only through dealers and the usual channel, but through like FedEx and Canada Post, right?
That's what my cop friend told me. He said that the joke is that they call FedEx the biggest drug trafficker in the world because it's so easy to ship a few grams of it that doesn't get checked. If you have less than, I don't know what it is, 20 grams or something, Canada Post or the customs officials might not even check what's inside. So it's really hard to control the supply. Even now in a pandemic, there's still a supply from various routes. And so they do need to do a better job. China needs to do a better job of controlling the production of fentanyl, and Mexico and other places where it's produced. But from our point of view, I think education and enlightenment of people who haven't tried it yet, and then for the people who are the users and who are addicted, don't treat them like criminals. Don't treat them like toddlers. Treat them like people who have a bad disease that needs to be managed. And I think if we change our attitude and see them as victims, sometimes self-induced victims, but victims of this, I think we can take a much healthier approach to controlling it. It's a hard thing to ever stop, but and the other real truth is that everywhere that's liberally given safe supply of drugs like methadone or hydromorphone, or replace the fentanyl with drugs that people are less likely to die from, has seen a big drop in the death rate from opioid abuse. Because the thing I say to people is, if you're addicted to alcohol or cocaine or gambling or whatever, you might destroy your family and your lives, but the chance of you killing yourselves in 5 or 10 years is actually relatively low. If you're addicted to opioids, the chances of you dying in 1 year is about 10% in some of these places. I mean, so you've got to keep these people alive long enough to get off their habits, to get back to productive lives. And, and there's a lot of steps to doing that, but treating them like criminals is not the answer. It never, ever. The war on drugs has been an abject failure.
Yeah. Well, thank you for shedding so much light on the subject in a very kind and tender and riveting way.
Thank you.
One tiny last question. Did you ever read Stephen King's The Stand?
Yes, years ago.
Do you remember his interpretation? Jay Bodine writes, what do you think about his interpretation of a global pandemic? I don't know if you remember.
He's so dark. I mean, like, My pandemic interpretation is a light romp through the park, even compared to COVID, but compared to Stephen King's The Stand, where the world was such a, an awful place after. See, I'm hopeful, like you had alluded to before, and to end on a hopeful note, after previous pandemics have come good times. And that was my whole the whole point of my article in the Toronto Star. I'm seeing some signs of humanity, of people reevaluating their lives and reorganizing their priorities in a positive way out of this pandemic. I think good things can come from a pandemic. God help us if we go the Stephen King route from this pandemic.
Yeah, well, thank you for your hopeful take on it. We've learned a lot, and it leaves us with a lot of things to think about and look forward to. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Dina, for having me. It was a pleasure. And thank you so many people for participating and writing in with your great questions. And if we didn't get to them, I'm sorry, but hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you, Cynthia. It was great. And Dina and everybody behind the scenes. Really, thanks for all your time, everybody.